So good morning and welcome back. Another great day, final day of our summit, but we have a great speaker that I am very pleased to finally get to Arkansas. I have had the pleasure of knowing this gentleman for a few years now. Absolute leader in the realm of STEM education and STEM development, and I'm just proud to have Mr. Jeff Weld here. Jeff is a science educator serving as Senior Policy Advisor in STEM education. He has been serving on loan from Iowa to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy for some time. He actually led the work, which I was privileged enough to be involved in, of the development and adoption of the nation's STEM 5-year plan. So to have Jeff here is just a phenomenal opportunity for our state and our educators. And when it comes to STEM education, I don't know of anyone more knowledgeable on a federal and state implementation level than Jeff. And with that, I just want to invite him to the podium and tell him thank you for speaking.
Thank you, sir. How long do I have? All right, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Anthony. Anthony is indebted to me for serving the STEM community, but I'm equally indebted to Anthony, the state of Arkansas. The trails you blaze here are definitely incorporated into the federal strategic plan. Anthony's personal input has manifested as fingerprints in this federal STEM plan. As kickoff, I think you see the cover somewhere, but I have it right here in my hand. Merely 144 printed copies of this, if you can imagine that, and I've got one. There is rare enough to be put up on eBay, but they're electronically available as a PDF and widely distributed in that fashion. But I think I'm going to poll you all with a couple of questions about America's strategy for STEM education. Did you know prior to this week that there was a new federal STEM education strategic plan? Show of hands. Only 1 out of 5. Well, then we've got our marketing work cut out for us. How about this? Did you know that there was a 2013 version of a federal STEM education strategic plan? A couple, 3 did. Well, you're doing well comparatively because I did not. And I've been leading the Iowa Governor's STEM Advisory Council, as Anthony mentioned, since 2011. And over the course of that almost decade now, we, like so many states, developed state STEM education strategic plans. Ours was called a STEM roadmap, and to this day I know that Massachusetts, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Minnesota, so many states have a STEM strategic plan. And I've been fortunate over the years to convene with people like Anthony, leaders in STEM education across the states, and none of us knew there was a 2013 federal STEM education strategic plan, and I so wish I had known about it because we reinvented a wheel, which we in education do way too often. And we created Iowa's STEM education roadmap blind to national or federal guidance, and we winged it in a way. And now looking at the state STEM plans of other states that were written ahead of this document, everybody more or less winged it, except for the informal convenings that we would conduct with each other. And now some organizations have sprung up that are convening state STEM leaders. But the strangest thing happened on the way to the office, starting like a lame stand-up, right? It was 2017, it was September, and Iowa STEM was doing its Iowa STEM thing. And part of Iowa STEM thing, at least my role as this director, was to collaborate a lot with my peers in other states. And through the course of that collaboration, I was very fortunate to be invited to pen a book about STEM education in America by the National Science Teachers Association. And actually that was late 2016. By August of 2017, that book had been published. So shameless plug, Creating a STEM Culture for Teaching and Learning is that title. The reason I mention it, of course, I love the fact that everybody might read it, but the reason I mention it is because that book precipitated a conversation that changed certainly the course of my life and hopefully the course of STEM education in America too, because somebody noticed it in the administration at the White House. So it was in September of 2017, I got a phone call, and it was a young woman in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy asking me about STEM education. I was really honored, as I have always felt and continue to feel to this moment, that I'm a mere vessel or a channel of a lot of collective wisdom. All my pals, the people on the Governor's STEM Council of Iowa, colleagues across the nation that I've come to know, I'm a mere aggregator of all these people's wisdom. That book was an aggregation of all these people's wisdom. So the opportunity to channel all that wisdom to this person on the phone that day in September was really a great opportunity. And I wasn't entirely sure what she was getting at, but it's not unusual to entertain a phone call from a nonprofit leader or an elected official or a director of another state that's just getting the STEM Act going. And so we fielded a lot of these calls. It felt like one of those until maybe the third phone call in September when she continued to press on things like how do you connect business and education and how do you assess what you're doing and how do you enlist the support of the public and all this, going on and on until finally she revealed her purpose, which is we've got to generate a federal STEM plan. Would you help us? And that was a jaw-drop shock in the moment, as I'm sure it would be for any of us, followed by very intense examination of the question, a lot of reflection, a lot of talking with colleagues, spouse, children, friends, the dog, until finally making a decision back to her. And my governor, by the way, who I answer to this day, Governor Kim Reynolds, who was in Arkansas just a couple of weeks ago, highly impressed with Governor Hutchison and the activity in computer science taking place in Arkansas. But it's ultimately her that I answer to, so I approached the governor and told her that the feds are on the hook for a new federal STEM plan. They're on the hook because it's a congressional mandate. The America Competes Act of 2010, it was actually a reauthorization of that act, requires that the federal government produce a 5-year strategic plan for STEM education. The first one was 2013. It took from 2010 to 2013 to generate that first one. And so one of the scary aspects of this was our governor agreed, and I agreed, my family agreed, and our STEM council in Iowa agreed to a 1-year loan, as Anthony put it. So by December of 2017, I ventured out on a 1-year loan. The reason that was scary because we all knew it took 3 years to generate the first one, and I kind of arrived and said, I've got 1 year. And everybody scoffed and said, can't happen, you'll never make it. The happy news is this document dropped on America December 4th of 2018, so just under a year. But I don't recommend that pace. It was crazy, chaotic, aged me quite a bit. But it's a remarkable document, and I'm going to share with you the ways that your fingerprints are in it, and hopefully it resonates with you. But that was the ancient history, the drama that led to its development. The 2013 plan I hadn't heard of, and nearly anybody aside from just a few of you had even heard of, because it was very internal. The actual statute, I don't want to get very wonky here, but an aside, the ACA requires this plan because there's 15 federal agencies doing some version of STEM education. I'm sure you know many of them: the Department of Education, Defense, NOAA, NASA, Department of Education, EPA, USGS. I'm sure you're familiar with these and likely a lot more. And they, up until 2010, were, I think it's fair to say, discoordinated, uncoordinated about what they're doing with STEM education. Meanwhile, spending $3.2 billion of our dollars to execute their STEM programming with minimal interagency collaboration and also minimal input from we, the stakeholders across the country. So I love this law and what it asks them to do. Let's get our collective act together. Let's coordinate what we're doing in STEM education. And that's the origin or the genesis of this mandate. So that 2013 plan was very internal, and that's how they saw it, is to regulate what we do internally, make us talk to each other, make us coordinate what we're doing and measure it and compare notes. Upon invitation to come out, and of course my first question was, you had a federal STEM strategic plan? I wish I'd known. Yes, we do. Would you come out and do the rewrite? And I said, on 2 conditions, if I may be so humble. One is, can this one be much more outward facing? That first one, none of my pals knew about, and a squandered opportunity, I thought, to really shape STEM ed for all of us. And they said, okay, sure, whatever. And the other condition I put on them was, can we have maximal external input on what this one should look like? Rumor had it that the first one was generated quite internally by internals for an internal audience. And they agreed to that one too. Yeah, do whatever you need to do. So on those 2 conditions, I agreed to represent, I feel like, every one of us, the STEM education community, to get this mandate approved. The White House Office of Science and Tech Policy is on the hook for producing the document, and they actually realized that a little late, because that first 5-year strategic plan expired in May of 2018. So we had to indulge the tolerance of whoever the rule makers are to give us a little leeway, as the new one didn't come out until December of 2018. So I'm going to share just a little bit of the background of how we generated this information. You're seeing a picture of an epic inaugural gathering. I sure hope we continue to do it, but this was a first of its kind summit. This was that external opportunity that I came out and said, can we invite the STEM community here? And again, I said, whatever it takes, just get it done. Essentially, there was a real vibe of just get this thing done. And so we invited to the White House, through all 50 state governors, 3 STEM representatives from each state of the nation: a business leader who's keen on STEM, an education leader, and a policy leader. And they were all given 3 seats. Excuse me. And I'm incredibly happy and relieved to say all 50 states were represented. I was afraid that this would take on a sort of partisan tone and that we would be hit and miss, but it was incredible. All 50 states. I thought a real testimony to the commitment of this nation for STEM education, that everybody sent somebody. And not only that, but tribes and territories sent representatives. 5 Native American tribes and 4 of 5 American territories sent representatives. So it was really incredibly encompassing. So you're looking at an image taken on the Navy steps outside the Eisenhower building, right across from the West Wing. About 180 of the 220 folks who eventually made it there. The front row are dignitaries from across federal agencies. You might recognize Jim Bridenstine with NASA, Betsy DeVos with education. In the lavender coat is Joan Farini-Mundy from the National Science Foundation. Myself, and next to me is Michael Kratsios, the president's, I believe he got promoted since my exit now as Chief Technology Officer, and others up the line. So it was an incredible opportunity. Now that was June of last summer, and about a year ago, interestingly. And that plan had already begun taking shape by then. So Anthony and the other colleagues who convened, I think you're in this picture somewhere, Anthony. I see you, yeah. No, quite right, given your stature. What they were asked to do was to react to this emergent thrust. It's a question I'll ask you. I don't expect in this venue for you all to answer the question, but I literally took legal pads to meetings. In fact, I can name the number of meetings, 211, chronicled carefully over the course of my year. Amidst all the other things going on, I remember asking Joan Farini-Mundy there in the lavender before coming out. I said, describe a day if I come out and do this. What does it look like? And she said, there's going to be a lot of people wanting to meet you. And well, that sounds fun enough. Well, it was incredible. And of course they want to, because it's the chair. It's not the individual. I'll always remember it is the chair they want to meet. This chair, incidentally, was occupied by Nobel Prize winner Carl Wyman at one time. So I'm sitting in a chair I barely deserve, and then entertaining visits from folks daily. These stakeholders across the STEM universe were coming in to weigh in on this question. So the question I would ask them that I'll ask you, holding my legal pad, poised for their response, was, what do you think should be in a new federal, national STEM education strategic plan? If you could get 3, 5 top goals, messages, objectives for the nation in it, what would they be? So as you ponder that, everybody was faced with this question, and it ranged from the leadership team of the American Association of Physics Teachers, the leadership team of the After School Alliance, the leadership team of the Society of Women Engineers, the Society for Hispanic Professional Engineers, the Association of Science and Technology Centers, the NSTA, the NCTM, all these organizations, and universities were sprinkled in there, MIT's leadership group, Cal Berkeley, University of Central Florida, all the agencies I would bounce around to and have these conversations with STEM leaders at Defense and at NOAA and at Interior and at Commerce and ask them all the same things. So what began to emerge were, first, a lot of filled legal pads that I've saved just in case anybody should ever care, chicken scratch with their responses to that question. And what began to emerge was like a top 10 list. You might remember David Letterman. And David Letterman used to keep these top 10 lists, and I thought we had one going. These are things we were hearing all the time. And the things we were hearing all the time included things like we need to make sure diversity, equity, and inclusion is at the top of everybody's list. I mean, right, got it. That came up again and again. We need to make sure these kids are workforce ready. Got it. We need to make sure that there's a STEM literate population of Americans. True enough. And so I dutifully write these things down, and strategic partnerships between the world of education and the world of business, computer science and computational literacy, transparency, accountability, measurement, data-informed decisions, and on it went until finally, at this convening, I felt like we had a top 10 list worthy of sharing. In fact, at this convening, we had a top 22 list and put it out on the table for these people and asked Anthony and his peers from across the nation to help us narrow it down, or what are we missing, or which of these should stand out. And they were very generous, gave us a day and a half of their opinions, and over 100 pages of feedback on that top 10, and we dutifully processed that and made this plan what it is today. So now I'm very fond of saying, to borrow a phrase from the Constitution, this is a document truly by, of, and for the STEM education community. These were not the world according to Jeff. I like them, and they, by convenient miracle, they align nicely with my book, which was a great relief, but that was the voice of the STEM community. Over on the right side, that box mentions a Federal Advisory Committee. It's an important group, and I'll name a couple of the members. A new congressional mandate, the American Innovation and Competitiveness Act. I believe the last bill signed by President Obama in January of 2017 created this group. Speaking of outside voices, the AICA mandate was that the federal government would create an external panel of advisors, experts from across the country, to advise the feds on STEM. This is the group that got formed. They finally got convened for the first time in September of 2018 while I was in the OSTP. And they're an amazing group of 18 people, culled from, by the way, a 600-member nomination pool. Some of you might have been on it. You should have been on it. And so this 600 who's who in the world of STEM education had to, in some Herculean fashion, get winnowed down to 18. And there were 4 agencies partnering on that: NOAA, NASA, NSF, and the US Department of Education. And they would huddle in a room with these 600 and created these elaborate rubrics to pinpoint diversity of members, not only ethnic, racial, but geography, institutionally, grade span, so it's K-12 educators, it's informal leadership, it's university folks, it's industry representatives, policy leaders, nonprofits. You would know some, like Vince Bertram of Project Lead the Way is on it, David Evans of the NSTA, the president of Worcester Polytechnic Institute, the president of Florida A&M University. And it's quite a public list if you want to see it. don't hesitate to send me an email. I'm going to give you my email twice today because I want to hear from you, as I do with everybody, because I'm still going out to DC about a week per month in a consultancy capacity. And I'm kind of the voice from outside the Beltway now. So when I come in, they ask me, what's going on out there? So my only link to finding out what's going on out there is you. And so Weld, my last name, at iowastem.gov is my email, and I invite emails from anybody who can help me with what is happening out here that I can report back. And so I give you my email too, because if you want to know who's on this 18-member external STEM advisory panel, you can't find it by Googling it. Send me a note and I'll send you the roster. They got a hold of this plan in September of last fall, and by now we'd had the convening of the state experts. We got it down to a pretty good top 10. We're starting to write around them, write the research backing. And these folks got an early draft of that plan. They too really had to go with it. And I can smile about it now, but it was really nail-biting at the time because, I'm on the clock and it's September and my clock expires like Cinderella or something come December, and they came forth with another 100 pages of feedback. And so it was a wonderful, glorious moment of input, but it was also really scary to be able to process all that and keep everybody happy as best we could. I think we got to the point, and I know it's a standard fare in your worlds too, we had to invoke that Voltaire quote that don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And I began saying that to a lot of people a lot of times. Everybody wants a thing in there. Everybody has a pet objective. Some of them got in there, some of them didn't. And then people want it said a certain way and to a certain audience. And so it's a really good plan to this day. Is it perfect in everybody's minds? Probably not. And that was our takeaway from these groups. And then down in the lower right, the listening sessions that I was able to hold with organizations was incredible. So I'm going to now take this internal because aside from that interstate summit and that panel of external reviewers, from July of last summer forward, this document really went internal as was required to do. There was a lot, well, I should say first, somebody had to write it. The top 10 list was one thing, but putting flesh around it was a whole different matter. So these agencies you're looking at, I'm pretty sure there's 15 there, were convened every month. And I was privileged to co-chair those convenings with the NSF assistant director and the NASA assistant director. And at one meeting at which representatives from these groups were in the room, and these are people at the level of like deputy assistant secretary type stuff. And we said to them, we need writers. And they went back to their agencies and they summoned experts that are running STEM programs in their agency. So if and when you crack this document, which is easiest to find on the web by merely searching, I mean, you can Google search either Federal STEM Plan or America's Strategy for STEM. Either one of those. I'm 99% certain this is the first thing to pop up, America's Strategy for STEM. And you'll find there on page 2, the writing team. There were 40 of them. And they have a special place in my heart because they were handed this outline in July, late June, early July, and asked to pretty much have it drafted by September. Again, this was a 3-year process the first time around. So having gone out there without any family or friends or my dog, I gave this, every waking hour. But these people had families, and they had vacations planned and weddings to visit and other jobs, day jobs that they were charged with. So it was an incredible demonstration of their commitment that they rallied around the writing of this. So these objectives and goals were formed through all these visits. Equity, diversity, and inclusion became an overarching goal, bigger than any of the so-called objectives. It should permeate everything we do. Another overarching goal became getting all Americans STEM literate, and that should be woven into everything we do. And then the third one was, let's get all STEM learners ready for the world of work, ready for careers. So those lead off now as the goals of the thing. And these folks sat down and conducted the research and did a lot of debating about content. Meanwhile, there was a third condition, by the way, that I imposed on my leaders, and I'm so grateful they indulged me. If you look up that 2013 federal STEM plan, it is a dense, scholarly production. And I'm a great fan of it, but for the average practitioner, which at one time I was a science teacher, and I wouldn't have tolerated a 200-page, 10-point font, single-spaced, pushing the margins, read like a dissertation. And thereby it wasn't very accessible to people like us, consumers and practitioners. So the third condition, midway through the process, I think I delivered on them, was let's make this new one short, attractive, punchy, easily readable, highlights, examples, margin boxes, and like a page each, a page for each. We're not going to go on for pages and pages. And let's make the font big, and let's give it space and a half. This all sounds so silly, but it was legitimate conversations. And that's how it turned out. So if you look through this one, you thumb through it, it was projected totally out of the blue. I think early on upon my arrival, somebody in leadership said, "How long do you think this one should be?" No clue, but I said 40 pages or less. By some miracle, it's 37 pages. I wouldn't have guessed that was going to be the case. And each of the objectives I'm speaking of takes one page to get the story out. Here's the objective: strategic partnerships between school and business. Here's why it's important. Here's what we're going to do about it. Move on. Oh, and here's a box where somebody's doing it really well. And so I think it's really readable. I think a teacher could pick this up and run with it, a parent, state legislator, any imaginable stakeholder. And that's a credit to the writers. So now I get into the guts of it. That's the vision statement at the top, and the three overarching goals that weave into all of the components. I'm going to check the time. Anthony, you'll give me the hook or something, right? So around these goals became these pathways. There's 4 pathways. It's going to get kind of organizationally complicated if I go too deeply into it, but 3 goals, 4 pathways, and those 4 pathways chunked together 14 objectives. Should have been 10, couldn't hold it at 10. But one of those pathways is strategic partnerships. Under strategic partnerships, we're advising the world of STEM education to connect schools and businesses, or schools in the world of work. And you all are doing that in Arkansas, and STEM people have been doing this for a long time. Some of this is nothing new under the sun when it comes to STEM education. But strategic partnerships between the world of work and the world of education are now being asked of all of the STEM universe of our nation. It's happening very well in pockets. Almost all of this is happening very well in pockets. The challenge is going to be getting everybody on board. So as subsets of that, you'll see in the plan 1 page devoted to work-based learning experiences for students. Every kid should be getting the opportunity for an internship or a job shadow, or at least a project that's related to the world outside. And as long as we were at it, I was so glad we talked earlier about teachers in internships. My state has been operating a program for several years now, funded initially by the NSF, called Teacher Externships. And it is a thing of beauty. We're neck deep in it right now up in Iowa. Teachers across the state taking deep dives, 6 weeks, into local manufacturers or IT companies or hospitals, and doing real things in that 6 weeks to update their own content, but also prepare really interesting applied lessons for their students. So we mentioned at least 3 times in this document that work-based learning experiences aren't just for students, they're for instructors too. And I now, as a college professor on leave, I can attest to the fact that my peers at the collegiate level could also really use refreshers in the world of the employer. So this plan calls out work-based learning experiences as part of those partnerships. It makes a big deal of STEM ecosystems. And you probably know there are STEM ecosystems springing up across the country under the leadership of the Teaching Institute for Excellence in STEM, Jan Morrison. And I visited with Jan and said, We really want to put ecosystems on the radar of the entire STEM universe. You haven't trademarked that, have you? And she said, no. So we make a big deal of STEM ecosystems in communities, in regions, in states, in regions of the nation to drive these partnerships. And there they are. The furthest one to the right, blending successful practices. I can't tell you how many people pushed that we begin to think of formal education and informal education as synergistic partners, not separate silos. When anybody offers professional development, we ought to be inviting both educators, formal and informal, into that room. And when we talk about career technical education, oh, that's very helpful. Thank you, Anthony. When we talk about career tech education and the content core, as a former science teacher, I work closely with the career tech folks, ag science. If you're a biology teacher in the state of Iowa, you got the ag teacher on speed dial because so much of that is interwoven. And so that's a culture I came up in the profession around, and I'm so glad that the plan calls for us to integrate the experiences of the student, not only from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed, so that they're spending their day with you in school, and at night they're going to the local nature center or museum, and that everybody's kind of pulling in the same direction is a merger of the formal and the informal. And then the C2E wing of the school and the so-called content core wing of the school doing more collaborating, pulling some of the best practices out of CTE, such as hands-on learning, applied lessons, connections to the world of work, into Algebra 2 and into life science and chemistry and so on. Another pathway is convergence. It's hard to say which is a favorite, but this is really close because the idea is going to be the hardest one. Of all the things in this plan, this is the least mature. It's the least prevalent right now across the country as far as I can tell, and that is schooling merging the disciplines for big questions and big challenges instead of siloed disciplinary experiences that typify all of our teaching and our learning experiences. It's a 110-year-old model, the layer cake approach to 50-minute periods, or if you're lucky, block periods, where kids explore life science for this 50 or 90 minutes, and then they move over to family consumer science, and they move over to French class, and that's their siloed day. And it's that way because there's a lot of institutional realities we all deal with. So we realize this is a mountain to climb, but the plan is calling America to converge these disciplines, to permit and build learning experiences by which learners wrestle big, messy, transdisciplinary subjects and lessons and meanings where over the course of a day or a week or a month or a year, they're investigating the water quality of a creek behind the school or whatever, and in so doing, they have to command environmental science and microbiology, but they also have to command some sociology about the location of manufacturers, or in Iowa's case, so much of livestock raising, and what are the incentives to protect the local waterways? How can we improve those incentives? Economics is embedded in this, of course, chemistry. So big questions that converge the disciplines are an equity issue in every sense of equity, as I mentioned earlier. Kids of diversity are likely going to latch on to topics that interest them. This is not rocket science. In fact, the book the National Academies released just last April, How People Learn 2 is the name of the book. That's Roman numeral 2. How People Learn 2 is an expose on, it's an expansion of How People Learn 1, which came out in 2000, the Bible of cognitive science and how people learn. 2 is subtitled Culture and Context, I believe. And the upshot, the spoiler alert for how people learn, is that people learn through context, meaning, authenticity, and again, that's nothing new. But that's what we're calling for through convergence, is if it's going to mean more to the learner, it's got to transcend the disciplines, or at the very least, we as educators should be walking down the hall and working with the math teacher on the science unit or what have you, doing as much convergence, formerly known as transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. We pulled Converge from the National Science Foundation. Convergence is white hot in the science world as the front edge of discovery appears to be taking place at the interface of the disciplines of science. So the National Science Foundation is now incentivizing the convergence of disciplinary fields. We said, if it's good for science, it's good for science education and STEM education. Let's see if we can encourage and expand that scope of convergence to our education colleagues. So the word converge is used very purposefully. We'll see if it takes hold in the world of education. Keep me posted if you make headway in this regard. There's 3 objectives under that one: innovation and entrepreneurship, how to drive education in those spaces. There are a few models across the country where people are doing a really good job of educating learners for entrepreneurship, and things like maker spaces and competitions such as Future Cities and Math Facts Masters and math modeling. These are all around innovation and entrepreneurship. The second objective, a personal favorite, is make mathematics a magnet. In terms of equity and diversity, the singular most agreed upon consensus filter that's inhibiting America's ability to produce STEM graduates to meet the demand for STEM employment is mathematics education. And I heard this from math educators, so I can say with confidence that these were leaders from the Math Association of America, Michael Pearson, the American Mathematical Society, Karen Sachs, the American Statistical Association, Steve Pearson, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, David Moss. The math community has a consensus that they recognize they've got to fix math education. They put out a significant report, Math 2020. In Math 2020, it comes right out and says mathematics can be the Achilles heel to the STEM pathway for too many students. Too often, kids of poverty, kids of color, young women. So we come right out and say, let's make math a magnet. It's positively framed, but we are calling our mathematics colleagues and all of us to integrate mathematics in a meaningful, compelling way. And it's actually pulled. There was a paper in the 1980s written by Yuri Treisman. Yuri Treisman is a legend in the mathematics world. The University of Texas runs the Dana Center. Had the great honor of meeting Yuri. And during the development of this, I said, Yuri, we want to say something about mathematics. And he was frustrated, and he said, we in math, we keep writing the same report over and over again. And that is, we need math to be contextual, meaningful, compelling, taught in a numbers sense fashion that relates to the world. But we're not making a lot of headway. So we said we're going to put it in here. We're going to share how it might happen. So his title of his paper in the 1980s was Make Calculus a Pump, Not a Filter. And I said, well, we're not going to reuse Make Math a Pump, but we will say Make Math a Magnet. And that's how that title came to be. And I think it's being well received by the teachers of mathematics. In fact, my state, I'm so grateful. Governor Kim Reynolds, who has enormous respect for Anthony Owens, by the way. Kim Reynolds, our governor, is all behind this, and we have just launched a search for mathematics programming, pre-K-12, that is proven to function as a magnet. The students, having experienced it, like math and like STEM more afterwards. What a novel thing. By the time we're done with them, they want more. And so we're on a search for those, and thanks to Governor Reynolds, who has secured the funding to scale some versions of mathematics. So I'm really excited that my home state might take a lead on that particular objective and show the world how it can be done. And then transdisciplinary learning is an objective there. The third of the pathways is all about computational literacy. Again, the brand Arkansas has so deservedly earned and now owns. When you say who in America is doing computer science education well, it's an unequivocal Arkansas in any room I've been in the last 3 to 5 years. Tribute to you all. So we're all trying to follow your lead and keep up with you. And computational literacy takes that on, calling out the STEM education community that this is an overarching objective we all should be aiming at. And it's got some really interesting suggestions for how we might do that, thanks to the advice of so many people in the computer science space. cyber safety, an anti-bullying antidote, and digital literacy, internet capacities and capabilities with regard to youth and how they interface and interact with the World Wide Web, computational thinking, and computer science, in our perspective, is embedded there as a critical component of computational thinking. This is an argument that goes back into the 2007, 2008. Jeanette Wing wrote a foundational piece on computational thinking that has been recycled through the years, and we embrace that idea that every young American should have a capacity for algorithmic problem solving, where a device that can process data amplifies, excels, and interprets data, computational thinking. And what's really interesting about that is it's inviting the entire STEM community to have a role and a hand and a responsibility in this. As a former biology teacher, I now invite my biology colleagues to incorporate data analytics, big data processing, into biology coursework. That's the reality of modern biology. It's a reality of modern science across the board, is a software data processing competency. So hopefully that gets embedded. That's an enormous professional development undertaking. I know you guys know better than anybody. And that'll lead to a question I always get when I talk about this plan, which is there money behind all this? And hopefully I can spare just a few minutes for Q&A to take on questions like that. Digital platforms got put in there because, like Arkansas, Iowa is a rural state. And not only the rural states, but even urban states like Massachusetts and Virginia still have rural populations that make it too often a haves and a have-nots opportunity. If you're fortunate to live in Alexandria or Richmond, Virginia, you're getting world-class education by interfacing with world-class global companies and experts within the midst that'll come in and guest speak and do plant tours and what have you. But if you're out in the countryside, which is most of Iowa, what they're doing in Des Moines and Iowa City is very hard to replicate in Spencer or Winterset, Iowa. So digital platforms, imperfect as they are, we've probably all been on the receiving end or the delivery end of a digital learning experience. They're not perfect, but they're the best bet we have in the moment to level the playing field, to accord to those kids in Winterset the same quality education as the kids of Richmond or Boston or Little Rock. And the final pathway could also be argued as my favorite. Over the course of Iowa's STEM run of 9 years now, our governor and our council have very wisely insisted early on and often that we measure everything we do and we report on it and we calibrate or recalibrate based on what it is we're finding. So it's that context that I arrive in DC with, and we're developing the plan. I'm looking at the old plan, and there wasn't all that much accountability in the first strategic plan at the federal level, the 2013 plan. And meanwhile, the America Competes Act and the American Innovation and Competitiveness Act both are saying, moving forward, federal agencies will measure and report on and readjust their activities based on evaluation. So I would point at those legislations when I'm in a room of the feds, of the agency leaders, and say, we all got to start measuring what we're doing, especially when it comes to underrepresented student participation. That's explicitly called out in the ACA. And people do sometimes what people do, which is, oh, that's hard. It's hard to get that data. It's hard to get reliable data. We don't have the money. We don't have the resources. So it's against that current, and you've probably swam in that current too. It's against this current of, sounds hard, we don't have the resources. But I once had a colleague early on in the evaluative structure setup of my state, the evaluator, who said, if you don't measure it, it's as if it never happened. And that was Gene Lutz. And so I've quoted Gene so often ever since. If we don't measure it, it's as if it never happened. So I passed that on to my federal colleagues. It's like, it doesn't matter how well you're doing or you say you're doing. We got to be transparent. We got to be accountable. So we built in these expectations into the new plan. that we're going to scale evidence-based practices. We're going to find the things that are working, and we're going to grow them. And this is so common sense. I know we all live this, but to get it into a plan and put backbone behind it is really important. We all know too well the vendors and the programs and the curriculum that are out there that aren't tested independently. Somebody said they worked well, and they grow on somebody saying so. Well, we're calling everybody out nationally to say, let's start measuring what we do, and let's start putting resources into the things that measure well. And particularly when it comes to underrepresented student population participation. Let's make that a top priority, and let's put our money where our mouth is, and let's measure the programs that are actually helping us do that, because moving the needle on this one is entirely unacceptable. We've been moving that needle on diversifying the STEM education pipeline for a couple of decades. It's moving, but it's barely a nudge, and it's far from keeping up with the diversification of the American student populations. So I say, let's bust that gauge. Let's just insist right now, moving the needle is not good enough. We got to completely reimagine this, and that comes from measuring what we do and putting resources into things that work, using common metrics, and publicly sharing what we have. Neil Postman was a writer in the 90s about education. I read his stuff when I was in teacher training, and Neil Postman wrote a book called The Art of Subversive Education. Pretty sure was the title, The Art of Subversive Education. One of Neil Postman's recommendations for how to improve education is to publish all the scrawling on the bathroom walls about teachers and classes, and then give that to the teachers and have them inform their practices based on this frank and honest input. Although that could be a little rough and abrasive at times, I kind of get the point that we need to put what we're doing out there, and we need to invite our public, our constituents, our customers to comment. And so we're asking the federal agencies to create a new website, a one-stop shop clearinghouse, where all programming will be posted and easily navigable. If any of you have ever tried to find a federal opportunity for a fellowship or a scholarship, or you want to spend a summer at sea with NOAA, or you want to go to the Arctic with USGS, hard to find that stuff. And similarly for your students. Your students want scholarships or fellowships or federal funding opportunities. So in here, there's an action statement that there shall be a one-stop shop, and in that one-stop shop, information about all the resources available, but also information about how this stuff is measuring and what we're doing about it. Every year moving forward, this interagency committee is charged with meeting, examining all the data coming in, and moving their resources in the direction of those things that are working. That's a very new vibe, and it's going to be very exciting to watch. So anyway, winding down here, this chart is a delight. Across the top in vertical are the abbreviations for all the federal agencies that are involved in the co-STEM, that are involved in STEM education, including 3 new ones, by the way. I'm so proud that the first meeting of this interagency group was lacking 2 or 3 key partners. One was the U.S. Department of Labor, and in my state, probably like your state, workforce development, departments like labor, are key partners in the STEM education adventure. And so to arrive there and find that they weren't at the table, we promptly approached Secretary Acosta and said, do you want to be part of the interagency STEM? And of course they leaped at it. And so now you see DOL is part of this. Another missing partner that I was so pleased to draw in as coming out of Iowa was the USDA, agriculture. When Iowans hear STEAM, the ag people think that A is for them. And so it was like, we need ag at this table. And the Department of State, doing a lot of international, interesting STEM support. So State Department. What happened here was these dots, there's the 9 educational objectives I went through, grouped into their 3 pathways. And we sent it out to the agencies and said, we're going to publish this federal plan. Which of these are you going to help us on? And it was a really interesting moment because it puts people on the spot. Those dots were their responses. So USDA, I'm like, you go, USDA, you came in strong. Welcome to the table. Department of Education, Department of Commerce, mostly through NOAA, I'm pretty sure is under Commerce. checked a lot of boxes. And then certain, objectives like ecosystems. Everybody's committing to helping to grow STEM ecosystems. Maybe if you're the Department of Energy, it's because you're going to put out a call to all the energy labs across the nation to connect with local communities or state level communities. This chart's evolving almost all the time. Other agencies are putting dots in. Sometimes they're being pulled, but more the former than the latter. So I think that's about it. The nationwide call dropped on December the 4th, a day that hopefully lives in history. That's Jim Bridenstine and Joan Farini Mundy and Betsy DeVos and the Secretary of the Smithsonian, David Skorton, conducting a panel on the drop of the plan, and there were the few printed copies in the chairs of leaders. So 7 minutes remaining. I'm so grateful for this opportunity. I'd love to entertain any questions you may have, and always advice you may have for where we go from here. I did pose one question earlier about money, and I'm happy to take that one up, but let me pause in the event that you have topics you want to explore.
Well, Jeff, first, I went and got the microphone, so I get the first question.
Sure.
So first, let me say thank you for your leadership in this space and your continued work and just great products out of this and great discussions. In your slide about accountability, and this is something that we're really looking at in our office and considering, but on that slide you had common metrics. And, if you go back really prior to the No Child Left Behind reauthorization of ESSA, teachers had the ability and educators had the ability to really assess their students where they were, and individualized assessment of the students, if you will. And this is my personal opinion, I'm not speaking on the department in this stance. I think that reauthorization of No Child Left Behind really put us in a momentum, or put us in a pathway that we lost that trade or that skill set within our profession. I just want to know, what while we do have to have accountability to our stakeholders, our taxpayers, et cetera, what are your thoughts? What is the national feeling of swinging that pendulum back toward empowering our teachers to assess their students where they are and find ways that our students are successful, because so many of them are successful, but it may not be recognized on those common metric tests. So I'd just love to hear you talk to that.
Oh, Anthony, that we could unpack and have a great conversation with that entire subject. Some say the pendulum swing is encouraging, and that the anti-testing sentiment emerging across the country is actually going to help us get over that addiction with the standardized exams. If enough parents continue to opt out, we can just throw the whole thing away and start over. So there is wind blowing in that direction that might produce a positive outcome of an anti-testing sentiment. And the rub there is a classic one. Having been a teacher and a college professor, we have an expertise and a professional understanding that our public doesn't share, much like the local physician or the plumber or the dentist. Any profession owns a unique knowledge base and has to be empowered and trusted based on that credential to do what's best on behalf of the kids in their charge. But the funny thing about education, as we all know, is that everybody thinks they're an expert in our space, and so we have to win that battle of a distinguished professional pathway. But by shifting the assessment responsibilities solely back to the educator, so that an educator's professional judgment can be the sole source of these metrics, then we risk scattershot, non-comparable outcomes. And I think that was happening at the federal level. We'd come to the end of the year. We did come to an end of a year where one of my jobs was to write a outcomes report on the first plan. So I went to all the agencies and said, what do you got, what do you got, what do you got? Oh my gosh, it was all over the map. What they had was sometimes elegant narratives of qualitative assessments. Sometimes they had quantitative, surveys and numeric dollar investments in programs. And to make sense of all that and tell a comprehensive story was a nightmare. So somewhere there's a balance, right? We have to all say what's important here. And once we agree that what's really important is when a kid comes out of mathematics algebra 2 level, they can apply vertex edge graphing. All right, if we can all agree that that's a priority, then let's all do a standard metric that we're all going to have kids apply vertex edge graphing to some sort of a real life experience and produce that and be able to check a box that kid can vertex edge graph. And we do so. I think it's going to be a matter of being very purposeful with some high altitude, what's important, and leave the granularity and the how to the professionals.
Other questions? I'll bring the mic to you.
How do you plan to roll out this information to educators? I mean, I know I'm here and I'm hearing this, but on a broad spectrum, how are we going to get this information, and then what professional development we're going to have to really attack this plan?
Right. Well, that conversation is ongoing, and it's a real frustrating aspect in that there was no money to market this plan. So me and hopefully a small army of the people that had something to do with it are out there telling everybody about it. And the folks who came out and joined us have received, I hope not too often, updates from me and invitations to, the plan is out there now. Thank you very much. Please advance it in your community. The other day I got in the mail from a science supply company that I used to tap pretty hard when I was a faculty member. Pittsco Scientific. It's a Kansas City science supply company, and you guys probably all know about Pittsco. I'm still on their mailing list from back in my faculty days. I'm glad I am, because I got in the mail, as we so often do, either their catalog or, in this case, I got in the mail a 4-page, laminated, beautiful summary of America's STEM strategy from Pittsco. I just squealed with delight when I opened this thing. So often people ask me, what can we do? The other day I had Texas Instruments folks in the room with me, and they said, what can we do? I pulled out the Pittsco flyer and said, if all American businesses that had anything to do with STEM would just do something like this to your communities, and then the nonprofits of the world, as I mentioned, the After School Alliance and the NCTM, the NSTA, all of which are doing things like this. There's featured presentations and talks and panels at the NCTM conference and the NSTA STEM Expo coming up in San Francisco, and webinars being hosted by groups like STEMX. So there's a lot of promo happening on the cheap, as is necessary, but to reach the level of educators is really going to take a concerted effort of all the governors got alerted to the plan's completion, all the attendees to the summit, all those 211 organizations I met with, and each of them has since been communicated with. You got to help us now. Put this on the radar of your constituents, and let's see how it goes. Already, I have a lot of evidence that we're ahead of the 2013 plan. I've been in Arkansas, I've been in Virginia lately, Michigan, Louisiana, Texas, Idaho, Connecticut. There's a lot of wonderful convenings where people like me are getting opportunities like this. So we're very much in the infancy stage. I do tell everybody in my world, if you're ever going to apply for any federal grants, starting now, reference this thing, because they're all deeply aware of it, and you will be the golden child if your application or your proposal comes into the feds and you're citing America's STEM strategy and nobody else in the pile is. You got at least momentarily a head start, because they are being required to fund around this plan's priorities. And that's insider information that shouldn't be insider information, but for now it probably is.
Great question, thank you. And that will help our office in thinking about this. Other questions? So I actually have one more question if nobody else does, because I think it speaks very importantly to Arkansas and a comment that you just made. You know, I have partners here in the room that we've applied for NSF grants and other grants for Arkansas and for the benefit of Arkansas. And I know we're still waiting on the current EIR grant decisions to be produced. But last cycle, it was very obvious that the flyover states, Iowa included, were
conspicuously absent from the awardees of those grants. Is that a topic of conversation? Is that a concern? Because states like Arkansas, I think, are doing great things in STEM education space, and sometimes when we do apply for those grants, and it seems like they're going primarily to the coastal states and Texas, then it becomes a little disheartening on our stakeholders. So I don't mean to put you on the spot, Jeff, but is that a topic of discussion at the administrational level?
I'm so delighted it is, Anthony. And on the spot comes with the nature of this gig, right? Yeah, regardless of people's political leanings, this plan is a thing of beauty that came out of a current administration, and it was a very bipartisan undertaking. STEM is very bipartisan. Having led a similar movement in Iowa, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, the side of the aisle that says jobs, economy, or the aisle that says equity and opportunity, the answer is yes when it comes to STEM. So we walk a fine, it's not even a fine line, it's a nice broad lane of bipartisanship when it comes to STEM. But in this instance, the rural condition is definitely on the radar of this administration. It's mentioned in the narrative around diversity. We explicitly state we're also talking about rural America. And that's not necessarily our doing. The America Competes Act explicitly states that rural America is part of that diversity milieu. So we're very much on the radar of leaders, and I would expect rural America to enjoy a lot more attention. Certainly it's embedded in this plan. And you can invoke that in your next proposal, page 7 or whatever it is.
Sandra, write that down for our next CIR grant. I know she's in the crowd somewhere. Last chance for a question. Okay, Pam. Probably our last question of the day.
Could you address the concern we have for teacher recruitment and retention, especially in the STEM areas?
Indeed. Yeah, the teacher recruitment retention challenge, and then the subset of problems, which is recruiting teachers that resemble their students, so that we can have positive role models. African American male teachers working with African American young men is the ideal status. Having taught high school in St. Louis in an urban condition at one time, I remember asking Yvonne Springer, I think I'm hopefully mentioning the name that you recognize, Boston Museum of Science, African American distinguished, accomplished leader in STEM education. I said to Yvonne walking down the street one time, a lot of my students are African American, I'm obviously a white guy, what can we do about this? And she turned to me with a very simple answer. Just love them. It'll take care of itself, and so I do in my own way, try to love my students' diversity. But we'll never get to the point where we have enough teachers of diversity in all of its forms to look like, come from, and behave similarly to the students in their charge. It's just a long ways from happening. If we wait for that, or if we hope for funding for that, it's not going to happen. So generating teachers who can accommodate students of diversity, generating a robust recruitment pipeline and retention strategy for teachers, it's all kind of the same hand in glove. It's recognizing there's a lot of ways to peel this apple. And one of those ways might be that we imagine cross-disciplinary credentialing. My state, Kentucky, others have introduced a STEM endorsement, STEM licensure. Now we have a lot more leeway to an educator whose maybe strength was tech ed or chemistry. But with a STEM endorsement, although we're careful this doesn't get abused by ill-informed administrators, that a STEM endorsement can equip a teacher to respond like a utility player where she or he is most needed in a school day. There's also creative pathways to the world of teaching to be explored, where my state and others have built robust training pathways by which retired physicians or ex-nuclear engineers on submarines can find their ways to the classroom. So it's going to have to be some creative solutions to this until this whole system is funded the way it ought to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to the group, the questions from the audience. And Jeff, every time I listen to you speak, I learn something new. I took a couple of things away from this that we're going to implement in our office and start working with here in Arkansas, and just much appreciative to you visiting with us and sharing information. And I'll just challenge everybody out there to read through the report. It is a pretty easy read. I don't mean that in a negative sense, but it is for us to go through and digest. It's a pretty simple read. And please contact our offices here in Arkansas at the STEM unit if there are takeaways that you think that we're missing as a state and need to focus on. So thank you again. Let's take an opportunity to show our appreciation to Mr. Weld.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.